All right, so now we're going to talk about cellular respiration. So before we talked about photosynthesis and the process that plants are producing food for themselves or sugar for themselves. So that sugar represents stored energy, right? With locked within the bonds of that sugar molecule is stored energy. And let's say it doesn't need that energy right away, so it might take that glucose molecule and combine it with other glucose molecules, and it can form starch at that point. And starch is kind of a way that plants store their extra energy reserves. Or it might take that glucose and combine it with more glucose molecules and form cellulose, which is an important structural component of plant cell walls. So it's going to use the glucose that it's made for the growth of the plant, right? So it's providing energy so that the plant can grow even more and survive. Plants use the process of cellular respiration to unleash that energy locked within the glucose molecule to convert it into a form of ATP. So we know that ATP is a really easy form of energy currency that can be used by the cells. So it's not only plants that go through cellular respiration, but animals also go through this process of cellular respiration in which they're unleashing the energy locked in the glucose molecule and converting it to ATP. But why do we do that? If glucose is energy, why are we taking that energy and converting it into the energy of ATP? If they're both energy, they're both chemical energy. Well, think of it this way. Let's say you go to Wawa and you want to buy a pack of gum. And you pick up the pack of gum and you go to the cashier and you put down $100 bill to pay for that pack of gum. Cashier's probably going to look at you and say, really? All you've got is $100 bill to pay for this like $2 pack of gum? That's the smallest change you've got. How great for you, right? But if you were to put down a couple of dollar bills, then that would work really well. All right. Usually cashiers are like, we don't change out anything bigger than, a $20 bill or something like that. So that's kind of what glucose is. Glucose is like that $100 bill. It has a lot of energy in it. And ATP is like our dollar bill. ATP can be used to drive a lot of different chemical reactions, and we might need more than one ATP molecule. We might need a lot of them, maybe 20 ATP molecules to help complete a process. But that's okay because it's very easy to use, right? It's a smaller kind of currency. It's not big, it's not bulky like a glucose molecule is. So you're able to use it much more easily than that of the energy stored in a glucose. Okay, so here we've got, all right, our glucose, and so C6H12O6 is glucose in the presence of oxygen. So what we're going to be talking about is aerobic cellular respiration. So aerobic means oxygen is present. We're going to produce carbon dioxide and water and energy. And the form of energy that's going to be made is ATP. All right, so typically from one glucose molecule, right, remember on this side are the reactants, and anything to the right of our arrow are the products. So sugar and oxygen are the reactants. Carbon dioxide, water, and ATP are the products. So from one glucose molecule, we can produce anywhere between 36 and 38 ATP molecules. All right, so we're kind of taking that $100 bill and we're converting it into our $1 bills, but we've got many of them, right? So if you look at this, this is kind of the reverse of photosynthesis, right? We took in energy, which was light energy. We used carbon dioxide as our reactants. And what did we make? we produced a sugar, and it gave off oxygen. So this equation is just kind of the reverse of our photosynthetic equation. Now you'll notice I haven't balanced the equation. I haven't told you how many molecules. If you know something about chemistry, we'll have numbers in front of these different molecules. We're not worried about the how many carbon dioxide molecules we have. I want you to more focus on the molecules themselves and what are the products and what are the reactants. So cellular respiration can be divided up into 3 different stages. We have glycolysis, which is the very first stage, and this occurs in the cytoplasm. So it's not occurring in any particular organelle at all. This is just some reactions that happen in the cytoplasm of the cell. The second part is the Krebs cycle, or it's also called the citric acid cycle. And this happens within the mitochondria. So we are kind of introduced to the mitochondria as the powerhouse of the cell. So this powerhouse refers to the fact that it's converting energy. Once again, we're converting it from glucose to ATP. So that's what's happening inside of the mitochondria. So the Krebs cycle occurs in the innermost area of the mitochondria, what we call the matrix. And then the last step is oxidative phosphorylation. This also happens in the mitochondria, and it happens in this innermost or inner layer that has all these wiggles to it. That is a membrane that is inside of the mitochondria. So we're going to look at each of these 3 stages. First, glycolysis. So glycolysis refers to the fact that we're starting out with glucose. And glycolysis refers to lysing of a sugar. So lysing refers to splitting. And that's what happens during glycolysis. We're going to take glucose and we're going to split it into 2 molecules of what we call pyruvate. So glucose we know is C6H12O6, so that's 6 carbons, and in this image they're showing each carbon as a circle. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them. And by the end of glycolysis, really what we're doing is we're just lysing. We're just splitting that glucose in half. So now we have 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3. So there's 3 carbons to 1 molecule of pyruvate and 3 carbons to the other molecule of pyruvate. So we're just lysing or splitting the glucose by doing this. Now, there are enzymes that help to drive these different chemical reactions, but we're not going to give them names or talk about them specifically. Part of this process, because glycolysis is actually 10 separate chemical reactions that happen. During these reactions, going from glucose to our end product of pyruvate, we're going to store some electrons up in a molecule that we call NADH. So this sounds pretty familiar to the NADPH of photosynthesis. So if you remember, we had NADPH. So NAD is what we find in cellular respiration. NADP is what we find in photosynthesis. So that P refers to a phosphate, but kind of think of the P as representing photosynthesis, because we only see NADPH in photosynthesis and NADH in cellular respiration. Besides that, we're also going to make some energy in the form of ATP, right? So phosphate is going to be attached to our ADP to generate ATP. If you think about it, that's our end goal, is to produce lots of ATP molecules from that one glucose. If you remember, I said between 36 and 38 ATP. During glycolysis, we're only going to make 2 ATP, so not very much at all. And we have some energized electrons that we're storing up. Then that pyruvate molecule moves into what we call the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle. So the 3 carbons that are left of our glucose is moved into this cycle. And once again, we're not showing kind of the different reactions that are happening here or the intermediate molecules. We're just showing kind of the gist of it. So each one of these gray circles represented a carbon. So we have 1, 2, 3. As we go through this cycle, we're going to lose one carbon in the form of carbon dioxide, a second one as another carbon dioxide molecule, and a third one as a third carbon dioxide. So by this point in time, there's really nothing left of our original glucose molecule. All of the carbons that form the backbone of the glucose have been shed as carbon dioxide and given off as that carbon dioxide gas. As we go through this cycle, we are going to generate some NADH at different points in the cycle. And there's one NADH, there's a second NADH, there's a third NADH. Don't worry about that FADH2, right? And we're going to generate some ATP. So overall, we have 3 NADHs, 2 FADH2s, and 1 ATP. Don't worry about remembering these numbers here. They're just to kind of help demonstrate that we're mainly really generating a lot of NADH and FADH2s compared to our ATP, right? We said we wanted to make about 36 to 38 ATP molecules, and so far we've really only generated just a few. So for this turn of the cycle, we've only had 1 ATP. Now keep in mind that we go through this cycle 2 times because there were 2 pyruvate molecules that were formed. But still, this does not give us a lot of ATP. But fortunately, we have one more step to this process, and that is called oxidative phosphorylation. So this is our last step of cellular respiration. And this involves what's called an electron transport chain. So this electron transport chain is in the inner membrane. So this is our membrane, right? We see our little phospholipids, our eggs on legs, right? And then these green things are members of the electron transport chain. So these are molecules that are embedded in the inner membrane. And then we have here this enzyme, ATP synthase. We know it's an enzyme because it has that ASE ending. Enzymes are named after what they do. So this synthesizes ATP. So this is where we're going to generate a lot of ATP. Now, we've been storing up energized electrons in NADH throughout glycolysis and the citric acid cycle, and here's where they come into play. So all of those electrons that we stored up during those different parts of the cycle, we're going to take those electrons back out and shuttle them through an electron transport chain. After all, what do you think an electron transport chain does? It transports electrons. So you see these little E's being moved from one member of the electron transport chain to the next and to the next. And this generates energy, right? We said they're energized electrons. We're going to use that energy to help to pump hydrogen ions across the membrane. So you see hydrogens here, and they're going to move across the membrane. So we're using that energy from the electron transport chain to move our hydrogen ions across. Now we've stored up a whole bunch of hydrogen ions, and these hydrogen ions can now diffuse across the membrane, right? They're going to diffuse, meaning they're going to go from a high concentration to a low concentration on the opposite side of the membrane. As they flow through this ATP synthase, it's going to generate a lot of ATP. So this is where we get all of our ATP from, is these hydrogen ions diffusing back across the membrane through this ATP synthase enzyme. And that helps to attach the phosphate to the ADP to make ATP. I know this seems very complex, all right, but just kind of keep some basics in mind that we're just using energized electrons that we've created all along. We're using them to pass them through our electron transport chain. We use that energy generated from passing the electrons to pump hydrogens across the membrane, and these hydrogens are going to flow through ATP synthase to make ATP. So by the end of cellular respiration, we get that 36 to 38 ATP, all due to this process right here. So this is